Alan Garner, thank you so much for inviting me to Purdue. This has been a great trip so far, and I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, you got your start in the Navy, didn't you, with nuclear?
That is correct.
And you're still active in some way or another right now?
That's right. I'm in the Navy Reserves.
How does that work? How you can be a professor and also be in the Navy? How does that whole thing work?
Well, the Navy Reserves is a part-time thing. So nominally, it's 2 days a month and 2 weeks a year.
Okay.
So what I wind up doing is I juggle time between Purdue and the Navy, where I have gaps in one schedule, I can go and fill in with the other.
Yeah, very cool. We'll go back through your background in a second, but I'm very curious. What kind of stuff do you do when you go to the Navy right now? You hop on a ship somewhere?
Not quite ships right now. I have in the past.
Yeah.
So over my Navy Reserve career, I started off doing submarine work. Okay. So most of that was managing where the submarines were to make sure they didn't run into each other, which is called prevention of mutual interference.
Okay.
So that was what I did initially.
How do they prevent from running into each other?
They put the submarines in different sectors and they make sure that they stay in the sectors.
Right, because their job is to be pretty stealthy, so it's kind of hard to see each other.
Right, exactly. So mainly it's a management thing.
Yeah.
But
did submarines ever run into enemy submarines?
That's something that I don't know, and that would probably be something they would keep quiet if they did.
Okay. Because you can imagine, you're tailing each other, you're not telling each other to stay in different sectors, and then they bump into each other. Maybe.
Yeah, there's a book called Blind Man's Bluff, which gets into a lot of the Cold War type of stories. Okay. That's a very interesting one if you want to read about all the sneaky things that submarines did back in the day that they can sort of talk about now.
All right. Well, let's start from the beginning with you. How did you get your start even to begin with?
Well, I went into nuclear engineering at the University of Illinois, and my dad was retired Navy. Okay. So
family.
Exactly. So he made me interested in looking into the Navy. Yeah. And that was right around the time when Tom Clancy's books were coming out, Hunt for Red October, things like that. And I found the submarine work kind of interesting. Yeah. And in parallel, I was looking for a major, and I looked into fusion. And fusion was also very interesting. And then I connected the two things through nuclear engineering, which is how I wound up majoring in nuclear engineering at the University of Illinois.
Cool. And then you decided to join the Navy right after that?
Right. So I was a Naval ROTC student, Reserve Officer Training Corps. So as part of that, I owed a Navy commitment. So around first semester of senior year, I went and interviewed with NAV CO8 or Naval Reactors, and they were the ones that selected me for the submarine force.
Cool. What do they do at the Naval Reactors office?
So the Naval Reactors office, they're pretty much the ones in charge of managing and administering the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. So under their auspices, they have the submarine force, the nuclear side, of course, aircraft carriers, and the whole enterprise for research and development of naval nuclear propulsion.
Naval nuclear propulsion. So every submarine, I guess, has a reactor on it.
That's correct.
And all the aircraft carriers do too?
All the aircraft carriers have 2 reactors.
2 reactors. And then, I guess because it's bigger.
Right, exactly.
And then I guess there are all sorts of other ships that just have diesel. Or
right. We used to have nuclear-powered cruisers about 20, 25 years ago, but those have all since been decommissioned.
Why? Why did they decommission the cruisers?
Part of it was they were nearing the end of their life, and the other part was they decided it wasn't economically feasible or beneficial for them to have it. Whereas the carriers are large, they need to move quickly, so there's a very strong strategic reason why they need to have nuclear power reactors.
And, okay, so you've got these reactors on board, you've got a crew of people on board who know how to operate the reactors. Is the reactor also connected directly to the propeller, or is it like an electric motor that's encrypted?
It's basically, if you want to think about a standard steam plant, where you have your steam generator and it gives off the steam and then goes down. After the reactor, everything is very much like a traditional steam plant. Okay. So if you're obviously, you'd be familiar with the PWR reactor. That's what the Navy reactors are. Okay. So it's the same type of system. Cool. It's just instead of just turning a turbine like a commercial plant, you turn another propeller to actually make the submarine go.
Cool. Very cool. Okay, great. So you were, so you're at the office there, and then where'd your career go from there?
So I went through the standard training path. So I went through Naval Nuclear Power School. Then prototype, where I actually learned the hands-on. Submarine officer basic course, where they taught us the very basics of the submarine and how that worked. And then I went out to my junior officer tour on the USS Pasadena.
Okay.
So when I was there, I was radiological controls assistant, reactor controls assistant, chemistry and radiological controls assistant, In the first job, I was in charge of all the instrumentation and controls on the submarine. And we actually did an analog to digital instrumentation and control changeout when I was on board the submarine.
How hard was that?
It wasn't hard in the sense that, it had been done before, but it was a very interesting process because you have to shut down the submarine. You have to cut out a lot of holes. You're literally tearing everything out and putting everything back in.
Oh, man.
So it was a great engineering experience.
You mean the electronics.
All the electronics. Right. And other things too, because it was a full maintenance period. Right. But on the reactor side, it was all of the instrumentation and control was taken out and replaced.
Do you lift the submarine out of the water to do this, or is it still underwater?
They put it into the water and then they have to balance it to lift. So it's not like a crane. Okay. You actually bring it in and you set it on the blocks in the water, and then you remove the water.
Okay, cool.
And then you have to bring it back out. So that's a very intense operation. Yeah. And that's something that people in my reserve community actually help with docking and undocking.
Because they've experienced. They've done been through it before. Nothing counts like experience. So they swapped out into digital controls. Have they done that on all of the ships since? Is everything digital now in the Navy?
I believe so. I've been a little bit out of the loop on that, but we were going through that in the 90s and 2000s, and the newer submarines all are. So I'd imagine so.
How come we can't do that for normal nuclear power plants? How come we can't just swap it all up?
Different regulatory environments, different cost drivers. In the Navy, obviously, there's a lot of operational desires, right? So you have different motivating factors.
Yes. Okay, cool. And then when you said you were working on the prototype, what is a nuclear prototype?
Well, we have a few prototype areas still in the Navy. One is in upstate New York. The other is down in Charleston. I went to the one in Charleston. And what they do is they use moored training ships, which are basically previous submarines that they refit. And they basically take out the part of the submarine that was used to control driving the submarine, the control room, torpedo room, and all that. They replace that with offices and extra protection things. And then they bring the submarine into port in Charleston and use that to train the operators.
Cool. But it's still got a real reactor there?
Still a real reactor. Most of the engineering plant is still the same. They changed certain things for protection and whatnot because it's in port and not out at sea. But fundamentally, it's the same. Right. But fundamentally, it's the same submarine that you would operate out in the world. Although usually, back when I went in, we were using older submarines. Now they're in the process of changing those out to be Los Angeles class. Which will soon be replaced all by Virginia in the following class, but there are still Los Angeles class out there.
I was just talking with one of your colleagues, Robert, and we were joking around how in Star Trek, something goes wrong. They've got this idea of like, eject the core, eject the core. The submarines have that same notion where if something goes wrong, you can shoot the core out of it?
No, what we are taught is to cover the core. When we go through our training, we're taught all the different ways to get water onto the core to keep it cool.
Got it. So you just flood that compartment or
Ideally, you do not do that. Okay. But that is...
It's a way to...
That would be...
It's a way to make it not pierce the hull.
Right. But basically, that would be the last resort would be bring in seawater, right?
Okay,
because that would cover the core.
Well, what else can you cover wet? Do you have like distilled water on?
Yes, because we have to drink, right? So we've got... we have to go through the evaporator or the reverse osmosis units that they have now. Yeah. We have a still, which is a mini thing that boils the water. So we have a number of different avenues. Plus, we have the distilled or control water that we use in the reactor. So there's all sorts of different waters that you could use.
What's the limiting factor for how long people can stay underwater? Is it just food?
Food. Right. Because the reactor is fine, right? Yeah. I mean, and you don't have to surface, but you can come up to periscope depth and ventilate to get fresh air.
It's so funny. I feel like we've got all these systems to like recirculate the water. Mm-hmm. You could probably even make air down there too if you needed to.
Right.
You'd think at some point we would have come up with a way to like create food, like from the carbon dioxide in the air. It's like super gross.
Like on Star Trek when you use the replicator.
Right. Right. You'd think there'd be some like basic food substance that we could create from just whatever's...
Well, we do have something like that in the military, the meals ready to eat or the MREs.
Yeah.
But that's not really a long-term solution.
Yeah, but I wonder if you could like take the waste and turn it into MREs. I don't know.
I don't know. I've thought, from a research perspective, one of the things I've thought about, one of the challenges you have on the submarine really comes down to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? Because those can only stay fresh for a certain amount of time.
Right.
And I was collaborating with a professor in food science, and we were looking at using plasmas to extend the shelf life of various fruits and vegetables.
How can you use a plasma?
So what the plasma does is it creates reactive species, basically charged particles. Yeah. And those charged particles attack the cell walls of microorganisms and kills them. So by doing that, you can actually extend the shelf life, because if there are no microorganisms on the fruits and vegetables,
it couldn't decay.
Exactly.
So cool.
Yeah.
So what's come of that? Anything?
No, we couldn't. I tried to pitch it to the folks at DoD, but I couldn't find the right people to pitch it to.
Yeah.
Because you would have to put the system on the submarine. But in principle, if you could do that, you could help to extend the shelf life of these things. You could imagine treating them with the plasma and then putting them back into the refrigerator.
Yeah. Could you put them in a vacuum? Can things that decay?
The problem is that the fruits and vegetables don't like the vacuum anymore.
They don't like it either.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the challenge with that, right? You're right. That would kill the microorganism, but also kill the fruit and the vegetable.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. After the Navy, you went to GE research? Or?
Right. So, there's a little space in there. So I did ROTC.
Okay.
So I did that for undergraduate, and then I took a leave of absence from the Navy for a year and a half to get my first master's degree at Michigan.
Okay, cool.
So when I was at Michigan, I did theoretical studies of cross-field devices, which are used in radar systems in the Navy and in the Air Force.
Cross-field devices. What's a cross-field?
So cross-field device is where you have, imagine a parallel plate, and you put a voltage in the middle, right? So you create an electric field, and the magnetic field is perpendicular to that. So what that does, if you imagine the two parallel plates and emitting an electron, is that turns the electrons. So this is something that was actually, as nuclear engineers, we think about the atomic bomb for World War II. Yeah. But a lot of people argue that the invention of the magnetron, which was a cross-field device that was used in radars in the UK during the bombing, they argue that actually played a larger role in World War II.
Wow.
Because you could actually see the German aircraft coming because of the radars.
Wow.
In fact, MIT was doing research on that, and they wanted to hide that. They were doing that research. So they called their research lab the radiation lab, so the people wouldn't know they were doing research on that device. Yeah.
Though giving radiation a bad name, though.
Right. But it's still radiation. It's just electromagnetic radiation instead of ionizing radiation. So what I was working on was doing theoretical studies and simulation to try to understand the noise generated in those systems. So that was my first master's degree at Michigan. Then I went and did the Navy types of things. And towards the end of my junior officer tour, I was starting to look ahead. And I wanted to go back to research. I really enjoyed doing the research side. And so I put in for the Navy to send me to shore duty at various places. And the Navy wound up sending me to Norfolk, Virginia. And so I called my advisor at Michigan and asked him if he knew anyone that did anything plasma related at Old Dominion or in Norfolk. And that's how I wound up looking into bioelectrics research, which is basically using intense non-ionizing radiation to modify biological cells.
Modify biological cells. How do you modify a biological cell?
All right. Well, if you think about a biological cell in a very simplistic engineering way, it's basically two spherical structures. You've got the outer cell, and then you've got the nucleus, right? And we all remember that from high school biology. Now, you can also think about that electrically as a combination of resistors and capacitors. As an engineer, that outer membrane wants to keep ions out of the cell, or it wants to let them in. It's called semi-permeable. It lets certain things in, right? That ability to prohibit the ions from going in is the resistance or the conductivity of the membrane, right? The membrane is also a bunch of fat and cholesterol and other things. So you can think of it as a parallel plate with some dielectric in the middle. So if you want to think about a cell like that, it's a sphere with a bunch of stuff in the middle surrounded by a shell. It's basically a spherical capacitor. So if you apply a voltage across it, what do you do to a capacitor? You charge it up. If you charge up that membrane enough, what happens is you actually move the water and stuff in that membrane, and it pushes the proteins and lipids out of the way and makes holes. If you make those holes big enough, everything can leak out of the cell and it dies.
Whoa.
And if you control how big those holes are, you can put stuff in and they'll reseal. That's called transfection. People use that to put genes and other things into the cell to modify it.
People are using this today. They're applying
Yes.
a voltage to a cell to make it more or less permeable.
Yes, that technology has been used for 20 to 30 years in biology labs. It's called electroporation.
Crazy.
So when I was going to Old Dominion, the professor I wound up working for was doing what he called intracellular manipulation.
Okay.
So again, back to our simple spherical thing, right? A capacitor has a certain charging time, if you remember from basic circuits, right? If you've got a resistance and a capacitance, you can calculate the time constant.
ICRP.
Exactly, right? So if you take that and you do the calculation for the cell, which is about, say, 5 to 10 microns in radius for a typical mammalian cell, comes out to be several hundred nanoseconds to a few microseconds, depending upon the cell type. So what my advisor at Old Dominion did was he said, what happens if instead of applying a pulse longer than the charging time, we apply a pulse shorter than the charging time?
Okay.
And if you think about the cell again, inside the cell, you've got the mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, as you learn in cell biology, right? The mitochondria also play a critical role in regulating apoptosis, which is programmed cell death.
Yeah.
Now, normally people would think, well, you don't want the cells to die.
Well, it's cancer.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, if the cells aren't dying properly, then you have cancer.
Yeah.
And the reason, or at least one of the reasons you get cancer is because the cells don't undergo this apoptosis properly.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the mitochondria play a critical role. So one of the things that Old Dominion and other people have shown is if you apply these nanosecond pulses, you can charge up those mitochondria. And that's important because one of the critical parts of this programmed cell death is the formation of pores within the mitochondria, which results in enzymes leaking out that initiates the apoptotic pathway.
So what we're saying is sometimes cells aren't able to go through apoptosis, the programmed cell death, because the mitochondria aren't functioning properly. In order to give mitochondria back their powers, we need to be able to charge them up a little bit to give them that ability to leak out the proteins. Is that what's happening?
Right, and that's one of the mechanisms. Yeah. If you ever get really interested in this, people have developed pathways for apoptosis, and you could fill the whole wall in this room with the pathways. The pathways are very complicated.
And then, because that would essentially allow us, instead of, it's just one other way to go after cancer is you just enable the body to do what it already does a little bit better.
Exactly. And Old Dominion and companies that have collaborated with them have shown the efficacy of this for treating melanoma, treating cancer in the liver.
How come we haven't cured cancer at this point? If we mapped out all these pathways to apoptosis, how come we don't just put 100? We have so many scientific research errors. How come we don't just put a lab on each of these pathways to apoptosis and say, all right, figure out how to supercharge this, and if in case something goes wrong?
Well, as I said before, one of the challenges with that is if you looked at the apoptotic pathway, it's massive.
How massive?
If you ever wanted to Google apoptotic pathway and look at it, you would not be able to follow all the paths. It is extremely complicated. And it gets even worse. Over the last 15 years or so, it used to be when I started off as a grad student at Old Dominion, people would speak about necrosis and apoptosis. So necrosis, loosely speaking, is when everything leaks out of the cell and it dies, right? Yeah. And yes, you've killed the cell, so, that's happy, right? But the problem is when all that stuff leaks out, it causes swelling and other damage, so it's not beneficial. When a cell undergoes apoptosis, what happens is there's a lipid that gets externalized, so it's usually on the inside, it gets flipped to the outside, and that's the flag to the phagocytes to come eat the cell and come take it away and all that. What scientists have shown, and they started talking about this a lot more 15 years ago, is that there isn't a clear distinction between necrosis and apoptosis. And some people merge the names, they call it necroptosis, but basically it's life is a shade of gray. Yeah. Yes, you have apoptosis. Yes, you have necrosis. A lot of times you have in the middle. These pathways are complicated. Yeah. Scientists, if you've pointed out, have looked into various drugs, various techniques. Yeah. People have looked into what's called electrochemotherapy, which combines electroporation with drugs. Yeah. So you can enhance the drug delivery into the tumors. Because one of the problems is that chemotherapy, the drugs can't easily get into the tumor. Oh. They're very cytotoxic. They kill lots of stuff, but they don't easily get into the tumor. So you need to put in a lot of drug to kill the tumor to get enough in, but you put in a lot of drug that kills other tissue next to it that you don't want to kill.
What does go into tumors? I mean, these things are growing. Something must be getting in. Why can't we just put an attack thing on whatever is going in.
Well, so that's an interesting point. So when I was a PhD student, so after I finished Old Dominion, I went back to Michigan and finished my PhD in nuclear engineering. And one of the topics I studied was modeling tumor growth. And it was an extension of a simple traditional model for the growth of an avascular tumor, which is a tumor before it recruits all the vasculature so it can grow. And the way that the nutrients like glucose and oxygen get in is by diffusion. So the tumors are actually, if you think about them, they're very evolved structures in the sense that they kind of work symbiotically with the body, right? They recruit the tumors in, or they basically grow by diffusion to a point, and then they recruit blood vessels to come in to continue to feed them.
Whoa.
So one of the challenges in treatment is finding things that target that vasculature. Anti-angiogenic or anti-vascular tumor treatments.
We can't get it before it recruits the vasculature?
The challenge is identifying it before, right? So if you can get it before it vascularizes, that's much easier. Or if you can kill the vasculature after it survives and try to make sure it doesn't recruit new vasculature.
Got it.
But it's that recruitment of the vasculature or metastasis that makes certain tumors.
That's what metastasizing means? I never knew that.
Right. That's where it recruits blood vessels and starts to spread. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So some tumors and some cancers are very aggressive with doing that.
Yeah. So how does a nuclear engineer so much about biology?
Well, going back to high school, I actually loved biology, and I was actually thinking when 27 years ago, potentially about majoring in genetic engineering because I loved math and I loved that. But I also didn't like doing a lot of memorization. So then I looked into fusion, and that was how I wound up in nuclear engineering. And then my advisor in undergrad kept trying to get me to take biology classes. But I was already busy with ROTC and working with the math department and just being an engineering major. And it was just because I wound up at Old Dominion working with that professor that was doing bio that I wound up doing bio. And I continued that for my PhD before I went to GE.
Okay. Now we got the whole story. All right. So when you went to GE, what did you do at GE?
So at GE, I actually was hired originally into a biomedical engineering position because of my background. And that kind of morphed over time into an electrical engineering position. And when I left GE to come here, I was entitled an electromagnetic physicist.
Whoa.
So over time, initially what I was working on, they brought me in, and because they titled me as a biomedical engineer, I was working on a project involving microscopy, which was kind of outside of my skill set, using plasmas and non-ionizing radiation for things. But it was interesting, and it was helpful over time. Then that first year, I wound up working on things like radiation detection. They were doing some instrumentation work, so I got to work a little bit on that. I did some work on non-proliferation, doing modeling with MCMP, just for a few weeks.
MCMP, Monte Carlo.
No, it was nuclear particles.
Okay.
Yeah. So, standard nuclear engineering things. But then my second year, the first year I started in the middle of the year, so I wasn't really put onto projects that would suit my background. It was kind of bouncing around. At GE, you had to be funded on projects to cover your 40 hours per week. So there's a certain degree of randomness about what was available. But after that first year, I worked on some very interesting projects. I worked on a project looking into satellite visualization and doing a lot of calculations into how good the resolution could be. This was funded by Lockheed Martin.
How good could it be?
That was 10 years ago, and there's also export control things, so I can't talk too much about that anyway. But the thing I can talk about was I got to apply a lot of my theoretical skill sets to that because we were trying to solve equations in Mathematica, which is what I used to teach for the math department, and I used it quite a bit in graduate school, and trying to figure out which solutions were the real solutions that the experimentalists were observing was very challenging and took a long time and a lot of effort.
Okay.
So it was a very interesting project. The other project that I started then, and I worked on it most of my last 5 years at GE, was modeling thermal stresses on flip chips for satellites. So the RF lab would make these very small chips that would be used on the satellite. So basically to generate the RF that they're using for sensing. The problem was, when you go up into space, the temperature is a lot different than what you have on the Earth, right?
Yeah.
So when you have a temperature change, you have a lot of stress that happens due to the change in the length of the materials, right?
Yep.
If you remember from a structural mechanics class. So most of the electrical engineers didn't understand that because electrical engineers don't take that class. But because I was a nuclear engineer and I took statics and dynamics and structures of materials, I actually understood stress and strain. So they had to do those calculations.
What practically happens to the chips when they go into space? Everything shrinks a little bit? Or what?
Right. So what happens is you get shrinkage due to the temperature coefficient, and that creates forces. And these forces can become very strong, particularly if you have sharp angles. So what I did was I was using a computer software called COMSOL, which is a finite element modeling software that can couple a lot of physics together. And I just did very simple calculations. I would draw the system in 2 dimensions for them. I would understand, the material properties and the temperature changes. And I would basically calculate where the strongest forces were. And I would say, if you design it like this, you're getting a very strong force at this location. And usually those were where the materials changed and where you had the sharp angles.
Right. It's usually, with sharp angles.
Yeah.
So how come these engineers don't know to just, not make sharp angles?
Well, the problem is they needed to do that due to space constraints, due to the RF signals. So it's always a balancing act when you're doing design, right?
Yeah.
So they would tell me, well, we can change this to do this and still get what we want. What happens if we change the material to this? Because materials have certain, in addition to the mechanical properties and the temperature properties, they have electrical properties that they need. So it's kind of doing engineering design.
And everything's got different thermal coefficients of expansion.
Exactly. So it's trying to balance all those things. And that was where I helped because I wasn't the expert. There was another lab that was more expert in doing the materials things.
Yeah.
But they liked coming to me because those people would try to draw the fancy 3D things and do all that, which is very nice. But they just wanted the down and dirty quick answers. Yeah. And it turned out that the down and dirty answers I could get with a couple weeks of work were sufficient for what they needed to get the device out.
Yeah.
So that was a project I'd worked on and off for 4 to 5 years at GE whenever they needed help.
Cool.
They would come to me and say, hey, do you have 10 or 15 hours to help us with this?
And you're like, no, but fine, I'll do it anyway.
Yeah. So the other project that initially doesn't sound very relevant, but has been very relevant to our research group was an electromagnetic interference project. So at GE, a certain chunk of our funding comes from external sponsors. Usually at the time I was there, maybe 30%. People like the Air Force, the Navy, DARPA, NIH, standard people that fund even academia, right? About half of the funding came from business units. So the project that I worked on for 4 or 5 years was originally funded by GE Plastics. Then GE Plastics was sold to a Saudi company called Sabic, and they continued to fund it for a couple of years. And plastics, basically, as the name implies, they want to sell plastic. And they wanted to increase their market share. So they thought, how can we increase our market share? Well, plastic is a dielectric, has a permittivity of around 3. Use it in all sorts of things like aircraft, automobiles, things of that nature. The problem with a plastic is that you can't use it to shield electromagnetic radiation because it's just a dielectric. So the stuff basically passes through that. Ideally, you'd want to use a metal. But you can't make your aircraft out of all metal because it would never take off, right?
Okay.
Or you make your car out of all metal because it's going to have 5 miles per gallon gas mileage, right? Not ideal. But, things are becoming increasingly electronic with control, right? Or if we're going to go to automatic driving cars. So things are going to become more electric and electromagnetic interference becomes more of a concern.
Yeah.
So the question was, can we take our plastic and do something to make it better shielded?
Ooh. How do you make a dielectric not a dielectric?
Well, you make it look like a metal.
Okay.
So how do you make it look like a metal?
Yeah.
And this is something that most electrical engineers don't think about because it's not taught in a lot of basic electrical engineering classes. And there's this concept of percolation. So percolation is if you have a composite material and you put in enough of a filler material, let's say stainless steel, which is what we looked at GE, you can eventually make it look like the metal material.
What's the percentage, though? How much? Because we're trying to balance weight here.
Exactly.
So it's like, can you do it with like 5% filler material?
You can. Okay. But it depends on the aspect ratio of the material.
I'm sorry. Aspect ratio of the material, yeah.
So you've got a filler material. So if you put in something aspect ratio 1, which is a sphere, you need to get up to around 50 to 55% volume loading to make it look like a metal.
Okay.
But if you use a very long fiber, you can make it look like a metal at 2 to 3%.
Ooh, okay. So if you embed a bunch of fibers throughout this plastic, all of a sudden it takes on the electromagnetic shielding properties of a metal.
Exactly.
Cool.
And if you use the right aspect ratios and such, you can do it with a very low volume.
And do you want these fibers to be aligned, or do you want them to be random?
Oh, that's a great question. So when you align it, you change the properties in the shielding.
Okay.
So generally, having it mixed works very well. But depending upon what you're wanting to do, sometimes you want it aligned.
Okay.
Now, you can imagine in a real device, aligning becomes challenging because if you perfectly align, let's say it's like this, but they put it in like this, it's going to change what you get out of it. That's the advantage of having it be more homogeneous, if you will.
Yes.
You know, the mixture.
If you had them all aligned in one way, could you let in some signals but not in other signals?
Exactly. And people use that for different applications.
Yeah.
So what my role in this project was, and again, this was something that I worked on maybe 50% of my time for around 4 years, was I was involved in trying to model that.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting project because initially when people think modeling in industry, they want to use computational tools.
Yeah.
So we tried to use finite difference time domain and finite element, which are two common methods used in these simulations.
I know finite element. I've used that before. What's finite difference time domain?
So finite element you're familiar with, right? Generally, things are in a steady state.
Yeah.
Finite difference time domain is important in electromagnetic radiation because things vary with time. So the challenge with that is you have the structure that you set up to solve the simulation, and then you let it progress over time.
And what are your increments of time?
Well,
you set those?
You have to set those, and it depends on various conditions, making sure that the propagation of the wave doesn't go faster than the speed of light based on your time step and your spatial resolution.
Yeah.
And the things can be very computationally expensive to run.
And you're overlapping these. It's essentially finite element analysis with a time domain on top of it.
We did it separately. Okay. So when I joined the project, the guy that was working on the project was trying to use COMSOL to do this.
Okay.
And the problem comes in is that these particles that you're putting in are very small. The gap is large. So you have to use a very, very fine resolution. And we could never get a good resolution on the results because it just took way too long to run.
Too computationally intensive.
Right. So we got a finite difference time domain software to run. But the problem with that finite difference time domain was that we had to get something that we could afford at GE because we didn't have funding to buy, something like CST Microwave Studios, which we now have here at Purdue. So we were using a free software.
Wait, GE is one of the biggest companies, or at least it was one of the biggest companies in the world. What do you mean they couldn't?
Yes, but we were on a budget for the research project.
But they should have resources that you can use across the company, right?
Yes, but the problem is those are being used across the company. So if you have one license and you're trying to use that license, it's not as simple as it sounds.
Oh.
So again, that didn't work well. So what I came up with was I was looking at different theories.
Yeah.
And the theories for that are very complicated. So I finally hit upon a semi-empirical method that allowed me to develop fitting parameters that would be predictive. So I knew that these fitting parameters varied with material in a certain way, with volume loading, with geometry. And the reason we cared was that we wanted to develop a graphical user interface that a plastics or SABIC customer could come in and say, I want to shield this amount, or I want to get this much out, because they don't always want to block everything.
How did you know how the parameters varied with different materials, though, if you didn't experimentally test them?
We did experiment.
Okay, got it.
So we did experiments with stainless steel. We looked at spheres. We looked at cylinders. We looked at
I got it. Then you fed that into the predictive model, and now you have this interface which you can which you can then say, we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we can assume.
Right. So it's one step better than just doing, say, an arbitrary fitting, which is what some people wanted to do. And it's one step below doing something that was pure first principles, which would just be too hard. And where this came in handy here at Purdue is we now have funding from the Office of Naval Research to take those concepts and apply it to what's called a nonlinear transmission line. So a transmission line, in a very simple way to think about this, is a long cable with some dielectric in the middle, right? And you can represent that in circuits as a combination of capacitors and inductors, right? This is something that's standardly done in electrical engineering. Now, if you change the capacitance to be a function of voltage and or the inductor to be a function of the current, you make what's called a nonlinear transmission line.
Just so I can clarify, this transmission line, what size are we talking about here? How physically big is this?
Maybe around 3 to 4 meters, depending upon what you're trying to do.
And
this is something we're actually trying to design right now.
And how thick is this? We're talking about like an actual electric transmission
Yes, this would be an actual transmission line.
Okay, so then go back to what you were saying. So you're saying nonlinear, or
it's called nonlinear because the capacitance varies with voltage now instead of being constant.
Okay.
And the inductance varies with current instead of being
But
constant.
The current's still moving in one direction.
Right. Everything's still moving in one direction.
Okay.
But this nonlinearity causes an electric shock wave. Okay. The shock wave generates a radio frequency signal that can then be used to drive a high power microwave system, which can then be used to, project a radar or a pulse or something along those lines.
Walk me through it one more time. You're using the cable to create what exactly? To create an electromagnetic shockwave.
Right, which creates an RF signal.
A specific RF signal?
Well, that's something that could be tuned, but in general, you're creating some sort of RF signal that you can then propagate eventually through an antenna.
Isn't that just what antennas are, essentially? They're just taking a current and
right, but
pushing
what we're trying to do is generate a very specific sharp rise time. So by using this signal, what we can do is generate a specific fast rise time pulse that we can use.
Which could be data, because then you can pulse at ones and zeros and use these shockwaves to send out information of some sort.
Well, not necessarily information, but it could be information. Some people do use it for that.
Okay.
My funding agency is more interested in high power. Okay. Some people are interested in low power, in which case you would use it for things like signals and communications.
And what would high power be used for? What's that?
That would be used to interfere with other people doing communications and signals.
I see. Okay.
Right.
Very interesting.
So because of
you're setting up a shielding of some sort.
Well, we're trying to, so the other people would have to develop shielding. But what we're looking at is more the offensive side, and understanding the physics. How do we generate these signals?
Got it. But the high powered is a shielding, essentially, because you're interrupting. Sorry. Okay. So they would need to set up shielding to prevent your interruption.
Yes.
But you essentially are setting up some sort of defensive posture using transmission cables, sending out these nonlinear shock waves, which turns to shock waves, which turn into radio bursts, which
can then be projected out.
Which then just mess up other people's communication.
Right.
Cool.
Right. So we're involved on the physics side. So what we're trying to understand is, how do we use mixing laws? How do we use material development to control the properties of the transmission line? And then put that into a CST Microwave Studios, and then understand how we affect that signal and shockwave.
Yeah.
So that's one of our ongoing projects with ONR.
Now I see where it's going. Can we just back up one more second back to the nonlinearity?
Yes.
What do you do to make it nonlinear?
So there are certain materials that are nonlinear.
Yeah.
And so barium strontium titanate is a nonlinear capacitive element.
Barium strontium titanate.
Yes.
But the whole thing would have to be made out of that? There'd be no copper in there?
No.
Okay.
So this
is
is
too expensive.
So this is where we're getting, right? Okay. So in nickel zinc ferrite is a nonlinear magnetic material. So what we are proposing is to look at different volume loadings within a standard transmission line.
Okay,
so you take a transmission line and you sprinkle in some volume loadings.
To give it this nonlinearity property, and you are developing this software to model that.
Exactly. And we're doing the experiments to benchmark, and we'll eventually be testing this and seeing what sort of signals we get out.
Very cool. Okay, but so at the end of the day, this isn't something that you'd be able to retrofit existing transmission lines to. You'd have to lay new transmission cable.
Well, and this would be separate. This would not replace transmission lines out in...
Right. This would just be to, I guess, set up a perimeter around some sort of area.
Or it would go on a ship. I mean, it's funded by the Navy, so this would go on, a ship.
And then you're sending out these radiomagnetic shock waves to disrupt communication somewhere. Cool.
Yeah. And then obviously if you go to lower power, people use the nonlinear transmission lines, in communications and other things. So you have other applications as well.
So you're like, you're like almost like doping copper, and you're figuring out how to do that best.
Basically, we're basically, if you're thinking about, say, making a semiconductor where you're doping, right?
Yeah.
We're just putting in nonlinear materials into a standard plastic.
Yeah.
Right? Because usually the transmission line is some dielectric. We're just putting things into that dielectric to change the properties.
Yeah.
And then see what that does to the signal.
Oh, so eventually it goes into plastic, not into a...
Right. So what we would do is just take the standard transmission line. You've got some sort of dielectric in there.
Yeah.
So instead of just having a pure dielectric, we would have a dielectric with different volume loadings.
Okay.
And my students right now are measuring the properties and working on the model.
So this wraps the...
right. So we would basically be making...
Instead of the plastic sheathing that's on it now, you're doping the plastic sheathing.
Yeah. Got it. That inner dielectric.
Got it.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's one of our projects.
Yeah. What's another one?
Another one is there's actually two projects, one funded by the Air Force, one funded by the Navy, where we're looking into electron emission and gas breakdown. So
electron emission,
yes,
and gas breakdown.
Right. So think about a plasma.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's hard too.
Yeah, but you've got plasma, right? And it's predicted mathematically. The discharge that's formed, right, is by Paschen's law. It's a fundamental equation that we all do in our plasma labs when we're in grad school or undergrad, and we show this nice little U-shaped curve, right, where it's the breakdown voltage as a function of the pressure times the gap distance. Okay. And there's some sort of minimum associated with that. So in the 1950s, they observed that if you were at atmospheric pressure and you reduced the gap distance down into microns, instead of going down and up, the Paschen's law went down. And continued to go down. And it was hypothesized that was due to field emission. So field emission is when you've got your cathode and you're emitting electrons or you're applying a voltage, right? Eventually, the electric field becomes so strong that you're stripping the electrons off of that cathode. All right? So if you think about a plasma, what is a plasma? Well, you've got all these ions going around. And in a standard plasma, you're applying the voltage, you're causing the electrons to move, and they're hitting the neutral particles, and they're creating the ionization, right? So what happens is as you strip these electrons off, they don't go very far because they're getting stripped off, but they interact with the neutral particles. So you have this additional component of the ionization due to that stripping. And that adds on to the standard secondary emission that helps to drive Paschen's law. And what my group has done is we've analytically derived equations that shows how that breakdown voltage varies linearly as you continue to reduce the gap distance in atmospheric pressure. So people have observed this for years and they say, hey, it goes linearly. But my graduate student was able to derive from first principles, making appropriate assumptions, that it is in fact linear.
Okay.
And
what's the practical application of this?
Many practical applications. So one is in microsatellites, propulsion and combustion, biomedical applications. People use microplasmas there to treat the food that I talked about earlier, to treat microorganisms. Some cases you don't want the plasma to form, like in MEMS or NEMS, micro-electromechanical systems or nano-electromechanical systems. As you make those devices smaller, it doesn't take much voltage to break those down. So you want to be able to understand when that will happen.
Yes. But we think it's linear, or we know it's linear now.
It is linear. People observe that it's linear, but they could never prove it. So we've proven it. And what one student has done is she's gone down into the quantum regime using Schrodinger's equation. And what she's almost done doing is unifying all the way from Schrodinger's equation through different mechanisms of space charge limited emission, through field emission, back up to Paschen's law.
What tools does she have to use to experimentally verify that?
Well, I've got another student who's doing the experimental side.
Okay.
So he is looking at developing nanostructures. So we've contracted that out to the University of Chicago. Okay. And we've developed a range of parameters. And what he's also looking at, as he designs these nanochips, what he can do is he can look at the angle of the electrodes and understand, because that's an important quantity, that causes what's called field enhancement. Which, as you make things sharper, right, it creates a stronger electric field.
Yes.
But that's not well characterized what that does. So what he's experimentally done right now with air, but he can show where the transitions between these emission regimes happen experimentally. No one's observed that because no one's looked at air at atmospheric pressure going down. He's the first person to look at this.
Fascinating. Yeah, I remember when I was an undergrad, I operated an STM at Berkeley, a scanning tunneling microscope.
Yeah.
And we were constantly trying to sharpen the tip to get that nice little point for the electron to jump. That was in a vacuum. So
Right.
that wouldn't have been
Well, and he's going to look at vacuum next. So he's going to do the two extremes, atmospheric pressure and vacuum. And that'll probably be the end of the grant in his dissertation. And then the next grant proposal, what we want to understand is the behavior with pressure. Because in an actual vacuum device, you never have perfect vacuum. Oftentimes you have what's called dirty vacuum. So what we want to understand is progressively, as you go from atmospheric pressure down to vacuum, what are we doing to the emission regimes? One of my other students derived what he called a triple point, where
of which material, of which gas?
well, triple point in he's since renamed it a nexus, and that is where
that sounds way cooler.
and basically when he refers to a nexus, is that's the intersection of different mechanisms.
Yeah.
So we used a technique called a matched asymptotic analysis, which is a fancy sounding name.
Asymptotic analysis. Okay.
Right. So basically what that means is you take equations and you take the limits as things get big or small.
Yes.
And then that gives you analytic solutions where normally you can't get any.
Yeah.
And then you plot those solutions on a common plot and they eventually intersect.
Yes.
So obviously the solution is, the one solution is very good here, the other solution is very good here. And then the real solution when they intersect may not be as good, but it gives you an idea of where transitions happen.
Yeah.
So when he says a triple point or nexus, you've got two things intersect and then a third mechanism.
Yes.
So he's looked at this for space charge limited emission, which happens when you apply, back to our two parallel plates. If you apply too much current, you get a buildup of electrons, and eventually you can't emit more electrons. That's space charge limited.
Ooh.
Okay? So as you increase the current or the voltage, eventually you get to that point. What he did was he put in collisions. So he put in collisions, standard space charge limited emission, and field emission, and showed where all three of those mechanisms.
And that's your triple point. That's your nexus.
Right.
Cool.
And what he's currently just done, he just sent me the draft of
So these are like totally different properties than when we typically talk about triple point.
Right,
like
right.
the,
Triple point, a lot of times you're talking about the junction between materials and such, right?
Yeah.
That's the other reason we changed it to a nexus because it's a little bit clearer what we mean. But he also looked at the nexus between thermionic emission and space charge limited emission and field emission with no collisions.
Thermionic emission. This is when you get something really hot, it creates a little plasma?
Yeah, when you get something really hot, it winds up emitting electrons.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
So people have looked at that. They've looked at thermionic with space charge. That yields what's called the Miram curve. Other people have looked at thermionic with field emission. What we're looking at is putting it together and looking at that nexus.
Yeah. And what's the practical application of that?
Again, when you're operating an actual device, a lot of times you'll use thermionic emitters, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll use standard field emitters, what's called cold emission. Sometimes as you're doing cold emission, right, you're putting in voltage and current. I times V, you get heating. So eventually you may get some temperature dependence and thermionic behavior in there anyway. So understanding how all these mechanisms interplay
allow us to design things better.
Exactly. And then as we make the devices smaller and smaller, an interesting question becomes, how does the heat become important there? Because no one's really looked at these nanostructures. They've looked at them in vacuum, but not to the detail we're starting to look at. So what we really want to understand is as we make these devices smaller and smaller, we put in more and more of this physics. How does that inform our design decisions? And how would that ultimately get something out to the warfighter?
Yeah. Wow. Cool. As we wrap up here, can you leave us kind of just a note to the audience, where you think all of this goes and, how the world changes over the next 10 or 15 years?
Oh, well, I would probably say a couple of the projects that we're working on our bio side are potentially very interesting. One of them, we've been looking at antibiotic resistant microorganisms and using electric pulses with drugs to treat those. That could have some very beneficial effects. On the other side, the non-bio stuff that we're doing, I think the work we're doing on the nanostructures and the nonlinear transmission lines could be very interesting. Particularly as we go down to nanostructures, there are a lot of applications where people are looking more into nanoelectronics, 5G, for instance. How do those sort of waves interact with these little nanostructures? Because that could be very important from a stability or reliability perspective. So I think these could have a lot of interesting applications in the next 10 to 15 years.
Alan Garner, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's good talking to you.
Awesome.